Welcome to Living Legacy Leadership, where we explore, discover, and share insights, tools, and strategies for a life well lived into elderhood. I'm your host, Donna Kim-Brand, author, speaker, legacy strategy coach, and creator of the concept Living Legacy, where you choose to live life on your own terms while contributing to people, places, and projects along your life journey. I believe that the life you live is the legacy you leave. Now, the guests I bring to you each week all address some unique aspect of learning, leadership, or legacy. This helps you raise your own game as a leader in business and life, and also showcases some extraordinary people who exemplify living legacy leadership. At least once a month, I also offer a training session to skill you in game-changer thinking for your own application. So get your notebook ready or sharpen up your memory by tuning in your attention, and we'll dive right in. Well, today, folks, is one of those game-changer thinking days, and we're going to be talking about how to be smart like Leonardo DaVinci. I'm going to share with you the principles of learning used by Leonardo DaVinci to be the polymath considered the #1 genius in history, according to most people. Accessing the insights and wisdom of my colleague Michael Gelb, who's author of the book How to Think Like Leonardo da Vinci, you too can take on Da Vinci's approach to observing and acting on life all around you to express your own brand of genius. So just to tell you again that the book How to Think Like Leonardo da Vinci was written by a colleague of mine, longtime colleague. I've known Michael Gelb for 30, 35 years. We've waltzed around the country in multiple countries in the same circles, working together, for example, with Tony Buzan, who's the creator of mind mapping. And in fact, when Michael Gelb was in England as a young upstart, I think early 20s or so, I think he was going to college. He was going to attending a course on the Alexander technique, which has to do with body movement and getting the most out of your physique and physiology. Anyway, he was in London for this many years ago now, and he met up with Tony Buzan, and in fact, they traded services, so to speak. So Tony Buzan taught Michael mind mapping, and Michael taught Tony juggling. And in fact, a little side story, Michael, when Tony's book, the mind mapping book, reached 25 years, those of us involved in the network and a certain invited public were invited to Royal Albert Hall in London. I was one of those. My kids were all there. Husband was there. And we made a Guinness Book of World record for the most people juggling at any one time and same place. So we were doing this at the Royal Albert Hall. And I had been invited to juggle up on the stage, but I had to go down to the floor because when I juggled, I kept moving forward, and they were afraid I would walk off the stage. So that was my little story about being with Michael Gelb and juggling at Royal Albert Hall in London. Michael is also married now to the opera singer Deborah Domansky, and he's also a practitioner of Aikido. And if you look up michaelgelb.com, he has different interviews and programs and so on about creative thinking in general, but of course Leonardo da Vinci is his specialist subject. So Leonardo was born in 1452, so a couple hundred years ago, and he, of course, is considered a polymath. He's an artist. Although, frankly, you know what? He didn't actually paint that many pictures, at least that have survived. And yet, we know his work as some of the most famous artwork in the world. It's kind of interesting from a historical perspective. He was pretty much known in his time. He was patronized by a lot of the feudal lords and so on of the time, and he moved around the feudal kingdoms in Italy at the time, Florence, Milan, Rome, all these places, as an inventor, as someone who invented military weapons, as an architect and urban designer. He designed canal systems. He studied waves and wave action of water. We know him for his drawing of Vitruvian Man, which is purports to show the perfect or divine proportions of human beings and how they interrelate through things like the Fibonacci series with sacred geometry and so on. We know he kept prolific notes in his notebooks with odd features like writing backwards. Some people say it was because he was dyslexic. And we know that influenced his learning styles, and you're going to see here how some of his principles of learning relate to the fact that he was dyslexic. But whether that was the sole reason he wrote that way in his books, or there's also some speculation that he actually was trying to foil his competitors. He didn't want them to be able to figure out things he was still thinking through and working on and stealing his ideas. And so he wrote in this dubious manner. But he was a guy that, as you'll see through the principles that we're going to talk about in a minute, approached life quite differently than most of us. It's Leonardo DaVinci, meaning from Vinci. He was basically he had a father. He was fathered as an illegitimate child, but his father did stay with him for a while as a youngster until he was sent off to work as an apprentice in various art studios and other types of more bureaucratic institutions. But he thankfully was able to combine both artistic and technical skills in his future work. And that's part of how he developed his genius. Now, Leonardo actually lived through several pandemics. He was born after the Black Plague, which killed, they say, they're not even sure, somewhere between 75 and 200 million people died between 1347 and 1351, a 4-year period of the Black Plague. But as a result of having studied about the Black Plague and living through a plague himself when he was living in Milan, he actually designed buildings and even a city. I mentioned he did urban design with better sanitation and built-in social distancing in terms of the actual structures and traffic flow, such as it was with carts and walking, and just how the layout of the architectural and streetscape was. So he just took into account everything that was in his environment and paid attention to alternative perspectives, which frankly opened himself up to creativity. And in fact, the Black Plague, because there was so much devastation and required so many changes in how people were living their lives, it said that that's what spawned the Renaissance, during which, of course, Leonardo was a part of. And all the new inventions, all the new artistic upswing, upticking, and so on. But the other cool thing about Leonardo that a lot of people don't know about is how he thought about things. He was very much into controlling your emotions by doing things like avoiding grievous moods, as he said, and keep your mind cheerful. So he was sort of an early proponent of psychoneuroimmunology, because he knew that emotions, be they positive or negative, were contagious, and that your attitude could affect your immune system. So this was very advanced thinking for his time, and played into a lot of the choices he made professionally, but also personally. So in the book, How to Think Like Leonardo da Vinci, Michael Gelb has, based on his research, not only looking through the notebooks, but reading ancillary writings of contemporaries of Leonardo and paying attention to simultaneous Renaissance kind of inventions in the scientific fields and the philosophical fields and the medical fields and the religious fields, everything that was surrounding the upswing of the Renaissance in Italy, at least, and much of Europe overall. Gelb put together 7 principles that Leonardo put into play to live out his life in such a way and with such a fullness and a vast range of skills and expressions of expertise that he is now labeled, as I said, the number one genius across history as far as we know, and as far as we look at him now. So it wasn't that Leonardo sat down and wrote these out as his principles. It's something that Gelb himself has culled and coalesced and synergized from his research and his observations and his love of Leonardo, his favorite genius. So let's start with a big one here, and I'm just going to have some fun with you and talk in my worst Italian accent. So one of the principles is curiosità, which is curiosity, of course. So Leonardo, and maybe, you know, you're going to hear me say a couple of times that it might be related to his dyslexia. But the fact that his brain was wired differently and he couldn't always function in traditional ways was what prompted him always to be asking questions. He was just a curious person. Wherever he went, whatever he did, he would ask questions. What is this? How does it work? What if we don't do this? What if we do that? And so on. And, of course, he began keeping his notebooks. And so that became a repository of thoughts that he took to some conclusions by maybe inventing something, or by drawing something, or by working with other masters. Like I said, he'd gone into different apprentice situations because he was, you know, a kid on his own pretty much. In that, though he had parents, but it was raised mostly by his father, who sent him away at around age 10 or 12, which was normal for those days to apprentice. So curiosità was a very big underpinning of Leonardo's approach to learning and self-expression. He coupled that with another aspect, dimostrazione, which translates literally as demonstration, but what it really means is hands-on, by doing things through experience. He was an experiential learner, and once again, probably because of his dyslexia, where, you know, things that were written were too complicated, he would do his own experiments. He would literally put his hands into things and pay attention and observe in ways that went beyond what was available to anyone else at the time. And, you know, they say that he was able to lay silently underneath trees and bird nests and so on, to the extent of observing and then sketching birds in flight. And as they left and came to the nest, he was able to capture in drawings the bird's anatomy and the wing motion and so on, to such a precise degree that it looks like a photograph, though he was able to capture the detail in so much detail that it almost was as good as what might be considered a photograph nowadays. So this was a very big part of his upbringing. In the early work he was forced to do in the offices and then in the apprentice chambers. But he took advantage by using his brain, his powers of observation, to make dimostrazione a very key pillar of how he learned and how he operated in the world. Another one, sensazione. This is where sensations, maybe sensuality to a certain degree, because he used all his senses. Once again, he asked questions about life, being curious. He was working hands-on, and he noticed that it was through his senses of